11 to 18. It reads, "But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping?' She said to them, 'They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him.' Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?' Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, 'Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away.' Jesus said to her, 'Mary.' She turned and said to him in Aramaic, 'Rabboni,' which means teacher. Jesus said to her, 'Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God.' Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, 'I have seen the Lord,' and that he has said these things to her."
The most important question that you can ask of any Bible passage is, why was it written? Why did the author include it? John tells us that there were lots of other stories that Jesus could have included in his gospel, but that he chose to include stories that would help us believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. But how is that true for this story about Mary and Jesus? Well, there are many ways this story can help us believe. This morning, I want to focus on three: the surprise of transparency, surprise of grace, and the surprise of glory. That's our outline. The surprise of transparency shows us the story is true. The surprise of grace shows us how faith really happens. And the surprise of glory shows us who Jesus really is. First, the surprise of transparency. There's a lot of talk in the news today about the lack of transparency, whether it be from governments or businesses or church leaders. We're always hearing about cover-ups, scandals, where top leaders try to keep scandals from coming to the light. But when it comes to the Easter stories in the Gospels, there are no cover-ups. Instead, we get full transparency. The evangelists are amazingly open and honest about certain details that were embarrassing in that day and age. John 20, the story of Mary and Jesus, is no exception. There are at least 3 scandals in this story that John makes no attempt to hide or cover up. We'll look at 2 of these scandals now and a third a little later. The first scandal is in verse 9, which we didn't read, but I want to read it to you. "For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead." John here admits that he and the other apostles did not understand the Bible. In an ancient Near Eastern context, this is an astonishingly humble admission. Think about it. How many high-ranking religious leaders from honor-shame cultures are willing to publicly admit ignorance? I appeal here to my brothers and sisters from Africa and Asia. How often do male pastors in your cultures publicly admit that they made a mistake and misunderstood the Bible? Even more astonishing, John volunteers this information. No prompting. There is no need for John to add verse 9 to his text about them not understanding the scripture. If you omitted that verse, the story would flow just fine. But it's still more surprising because Jesus had repeatedly taught the necessity of his death and resurrection on the third day. The other evangelists are equally transparent in notifying us that the apostles did not understand this teaching. These are the apostles, top leaders in the church, those that Paul calls the foundation and pillars. And the evangelists readily admit that they misunderstood. There's no cover-up here. This is full transparency. But there's more. There's a second scandal here. You see, by including the story of Mary, John makes an admission that no typical self-respecting man in the ancient world would ever want to admit. A woman was honored above him. Mary, a woman, was chosen by the Lord to be the first witness to the resurrection. Mary, a woman, was the first to be commissioned by the Lord to preach this good news. Peter was not chosen for these honors, nor was John, nor any of the other male disciples. Jesus' choice of a woman rather than a man was not merely countercultural. It was downright scandalous for the early church. When ancient non-Christians read the Gospels, they mocked the Gospel writers for admitting that a woman was the first eyewitness. We have written records of ancient pagans and ancient Jews making these types of complaints about the Gospels. Jews and Gentiles alike did not consider women to be reliable witnesses. They were deemed too emotional or prone to fanciful speculations. That is the worldview that the apostles were raised in from childhood. It's why in Luke 24 and Mark 16, the apostles dismissed the women's testimony to the empty tomb and the resurrection. They dismissed it as an idle tale, as nonsense. Now, interestingly, it's kind of a side note, but in Luke and Mark, Jesus rebukes the men and calls them foolish and hard-hearted for not believing the women. But here's the thing about that. It was not Jesus who wrote down and published these things. It was the male evangelists. These men who grew up all their lives in a patriarchal culture were humble enough not only to admit that Jesus appeared to the women first, and that Jesus commissioned the women to preach the good news to the men, they were also humble enough to admit that they were foolish and hard-hearted not to believe the women at first. Friends, these are stories of full transparency. They are stories of confession. People do not normally confess their own faults voluntarily. Ancient Middle Eastern writers do not normally portray women with honor and themselves as foolish. But this is the kind of radical thing that happens when you have a true encounter with the risen Lord of the universe. The Easter stories are transparent truth. This stuff really happened. It is not myth or fictional invention. Nobody invents stories in which they themselves look foolish. No ancient author trying to convince people that Jesus rose from the dead would invent the idea that a woman was the first witness, let alone a story in which the woman is commanded to preach to the men. The only way this story would have ever been published as if it were true, if it really happened. Mary's prominent role in the story makes it impossible that this is a fictional invention. And no one in history has ever been able to refute this argument by offering some plausible alternative explanation. So why is this story here? Why did John include it? The first answer is because it's true. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. So biblical faith is not a leap in the dark. It's based on evidence, on true facts, on the transparent, open and honest testimony of the eyewitnesses. So the first surprise is the surprise of transparency. It shows us the story is true. The second is the surprise of grace. It shows us how faith happens. While biblical faith is based on evidence, this story also shows us that evidence by itself is not enough. Biblical faith is ultimately a gift of grace. You need grace to help you see the evidence clearly. Let me show you this from the passage. To do so, I need to return to the ancient stereotype that women were more gullible, more prone to let emotion cloud their judgment, more prone to superstition and wishful thinking. One ancient writer named Celsus, or Celsus, depending on how you pronounce it, actually made fun of John 20 for relying on the testimony of, quote, a hysterical woman, unquote. But did Mary really fit this stereotype? On the one hand, the text tells us that Mary was weeping. It says it a couple of times. But weeping is not peculiar to women. Even men in the ancient world were allowed to mourn the death of a loved one. Jesus, for example, wept at the tomb of Lazarus, even though he knew he was going to raise him from the dead. There's no evidence, though, in this passage that Mary was hysterical or that her emotions were making her gullible or prone to superstition or wishful thinking. In fact, just the opposite is true. She is down to earth, pragmatic, and commonsensical in her thinking. When she encounters the empty tomb, the idea that a miracle might have occurred, the idea that Jesus might have been risen from the dead, doesn't even cross her mind. Not even a possibility. No, like a typical modern skeptic, Mary repeatedly insists that there is a natural explanation for the empty tomb. 3 times, Mary assumes that the dead body must have been moved. In verse 2, she tells the disciples, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. There's no deliberation, no speculation about a miracle, just the automatic assumption that someone moved the corpse. Next, she sees angels in the tomb. Now, you might think that angels shining in white clothing would be taken as a clue that something supernatural has happened. But a supernatural explanation, again, doesn't even cross her mind. There's absolutely no hint of superstition, fanciful explanations, or wishful thinking. No, Mary continues to presuppose that there must be a common sense, naturalistic explanation. So when the angels ask her why she's weeping, she says, verse 13, they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him. Again, someone must have moved the body. Even when Mary sees Jesus himself standing outside the tomb, the thought never occurs to her that she might be looking at Jesus. In her mind, Jesus is dead, so he wouldn't be standing there talking to her. She assumes that he must be the gardener. So ironically, and almost comically, she asks Jesus where his own body is. Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away. No one can accuse this woman of being superstitious or naively prone to believe in fanciful supernatural tales. Even when Jesus is standing right there, resurrection is not even a possibility that she considers. Now, on the one hand, Mary's assumptions seem reasonable. I mean, as we know, when people die, they tend to stay dead. On the other hand, you may have begun to notice that there's also something unreasonable about it all. She seems almost too skeptical, too close-minded. Think about all the evidence she's been given. She's seen Jesus' miracles, right? She's even experienced one firsthand, right? Luke 8 tells us that Jesus cast 7 demons from her. She too had heard Jesus predict that he would be killed and rise from the dead on the 3rd day. Jesus predicted that so many times, even the chief priests knew about it. That's why they posted a guard at the tomb. Then she finds the tomb empty. She sees the grave clothes, which make no sense if the body was stolen or moved. She sees and talks with 2 angels. She even sees the risen Jesus himself. She has all the evidence that she could possibly ask for. But she still doesn't have extra faith. She still thinks Jesus is dead. Why? Because all the evidence in the world will not, by itself, produce faith. Evidence has to be interpreted in light of our worldviews, our grids for understanding the world. If our minds are not open to other possibilities, no amount of evidence will persuade us. The same is true of many modern skeptics. No, we need something from the outside to come in and break our grids. And Mary is no anomaly in this regard. The gospel writers tell us that the male disciples repeatedly that the male disciples did not understand Jesus' teaching that he had to die and rise again. It was a strange teaching to them. In their minds, the Messiah was supposed to conquer the Romans, not be conquered by the Romans. So the Messiah wouldn't die, couldn't die. The mere thought was considered scandalous, blasphemous even. Peter objected, "This will never happen to you." It didn't make any sense. It didn't compute. And they didn't want to ask him about it. So the teaching fell right through their grid. It didn't stick. It went in one ear and out the other. And the same was true for Mary. This cross had scandalized her as well. She didn't expect Jesus to rise from the dead either. That's why when she finds the tomb, she assumes the body has been moved. And none of the evidence presented to her changes her mind. So how does Mary finally come to faith? What helps her go back and reinterpret all the evidence anew? Jesus calls her by name. Mary. And suddenly, the blinders of her worldview fell off. Faith is a gift of grace. Mary had been desperately seeking for Jesus, but could not find him by her own efforts. She did not find him. No, he found her and called her by name. John here is alluding back to chapter 10, where Jesus, the Good Shepherd, calls his own sheep by name, and they recognize his voice. Mary is stuck. She's like a lost sheep. A lost sheep doesn't find their own way home. The shepherd must take action, must find the sheep, pick it up, and carry it home. And again, Mary is not the exception to the rule. She illustrates the rule. Evidence has an important role to play. But ultimately, faith is a gift of grace for all of us. If you read through the Easter stories in the Gospels, we are told repeatedly that the male disciples disbelieve despite having the same evidence, and actually a little bit more. Luke 24 tells us that Jesus ultimately had to supernaturally open their minds to get them to understand. That's what's happening here with Mary when he calls her by name. He's opening her mind. Mary was not chosen to be the first witness of the resurrection because she had great faith. She didn't have great faith. She was a closed-minded unbeliever, just like all of us are before we come to faith. Jesus didn't call her because of her faith. No, she came to faith because Jesus called her. Otherwise, she would have continued to assume he was dead. But why did Jesus choose Mary to become the first Easter believer? Why was Mary chosen to be the first witness? The text doesn't tell us. But I think we can take a gospel-informed, educated guess. You see, by ancient worldly standards, she is the most unlikely choice. Think about it. She was not one of the 12, right? So not one of the specially ordained leaders. She was, nor was she particularly spiritually sensitive or astute, as we've seen. She's kind of closed-minded. No predisposition for resurrection faith. She also has a checkered past. She comes from a place of brokenness. She had been possessed by 7 demons. Most people probably found that a little freaky. And of course, on top of all those things, she's a woman. In that society, Mary would have been marginalized on multiple levels. And so she was the most unlikely choice from the world's point of view. But that is no doubt precisely why God chose her. Think about what Paul said to the Corinthians. Consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise, according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even the things that are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. The world viewed Mary as foolish, weak, and insignificant and despised. She was the perfect choice. Choosing her to be the first Christian would make it clear to everyone that salvation is by grace. Not by human strength, not by human wisdom, not because you came from the right family, not because of gender, no, just by grace. So, no one will boast in God's presence, including the male apostles. And as we have seen, John has learned this lesson. He's transparent, open, and honest about his own faults. Jesus said the last will be first. And Mary, who the world would have chosen last, was chosen to be first by Jesus. Okay, the surprise of transparency shows us the story is true. The surprise of grace shows us how faith really happens. And finally, the surprise of glory shows us who Jesus really is. Mary couldn't see it at first. She was looking for the wrong Jesus. That's why Jesus asks her the question, "Whom are you seeking?" Mary was looking for a dead Jesus. That is, until the Good Shepherd called her by name. That was the first turning point. But it was not the end of her journey. She found Jesus, or rather he found her, but she still isn't seeing Jesus for who he truly is yet. Notice how she responds. Rabboni, literally my rabbi or my teacher. Her teacher, though, has one more lesson for her, a lesson about himself. He says to her, "Do not cling to me." And then he teaches her about his ascension. What's going on here? Mary has recognized his voice and grabbed hold of his body, the one thing she's been looking for all along. She knows that he is alive and not dead, but she hasn't understood fully yet. She can grasp his body, that is his humanity, and call him teacher, but she has not yet fully grasped his divinity. And that is why Jesus speaks of his ascension. See, there's a lot going on in these verses, but I'm just going to mention two things, two emphases that John has in his gospel about the ascension. The first is that John sees the ascension as Jesus going to his Father. And so, the ascension highlights his divine sonship. Second, John depicts the ascension as a return trip. So it reminds us of Jesus' divine origins and his pre-existent glory. But here's the surprise of glory. In John, Jesus' glory is, ironically, most clearly seen in what seems least glorious to the world. Let me give you two quick examples. At Cana, Jesus does a profound miracle, turning water into wine, but he does it with humility and love. Instead of drawing attention to himself, he does the miracle privately and saves face for the newlywed couple. John says, this is how he manifested his glory. Yes, he has astonishing power, but the truly glorious thing about it is that he uses his power in humility to serve others. Similarly, look at what Jesus says in John 12. The hour, this is starting in verse 23. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. So where does Jesus see his greatest glory? When he, like a grain of wheat, falls into the earth and dies. Jesus' greatest glory is found on the cross in John. It's not revealed in a naked display of power, but when he allows himself to be stripped naked and overpowered. If you think about that for a moment, you will look at John 20 with new eyes. Where is the glory of the risen Lord? Have you ever noticed the crazy humility of Jesus in the resurrection stories? The Gospels describe the angels at the tomb as shining like lightning in bright white clothing. But Jesus has no supernatural luminous glow. The Emmaus disciples mistake Jesus for an ordinary Passover pilgrim traveling along a dusty road. Mary mistakes him for a gardener. And here's our third scandal, our third instance of transparency, a crazy truth that no one in the ancient world would have invented. This is the divine Lord of the whole universe. His minions appear in shining glory, but he himself appears in the raggedy clothes of a gardener. Now, he had humbled himself to come to earth, humbled himself to become human. Paul says humbled himself even to the point of death, even death on a cross. But surely, now that it is finished, now that he has conquered the grave, surely now he would reveal himself in full power, shining brighter than the sun, for all to see and bow down and worship. But no, nothing like that. He appears as a gardener. Why? Because he is a gardener. Mary was not totally wrong. Remember the hour of glory of the Son of Man. It's like what? When the grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, and then bears much fruit. Jesus, as the gardener, sowed the seed of his own body, and then raised it up again. His true glory lies not in his power, but in his voluntary, sacrificial humility. That is why he shows his disciples his wounds. That is why even in heaven, when he is ascended to the throne, he still retains his scars. Revelation 5. John sees the ascended Lord on the throne. What does he see, folks? A lamb looking as if it had been slain. And John tells us that this is precisely why he is glorious and worthy of worship. As the Song of the Angels puts it, worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. Without the eyes of faith, we will just see him as an ordinary gardener or a mere human teacher. But with the eyes of faith, you see surprising glory. That's why Mary's final word, like Thomas's, is more a confession of Jesus' deity than a proclamation of the resurrection. What do I mean? Well, Mary doesn't say to the disciples, Christ is risen, he is risen indeed. No, instead she employs the language of theophany and cries out, I have seen the Lord. So, the surprise of transparency shows us the story is true. The surprise of grace shows us how faith happens. But the surprise of glory shows us who Jesus really is. Lord, I ask that you would help us to look at you with eyes of faith. Help us to think like you think. Talk like you talk. Treat people the way you treat people. Help us to emulate your humility. And Lord, we thank you that you are much more beautiful in garden clothes. It's in your Son's name, amen.